Months passed after the concert, and life slowly returned to a calm rhythm. The whirlwind of attention had faded, but Daniel didn't mind. He wasn't chasing fame. He just wanted to keep making music that spoke truth. Every morning he still took the same bus, greeted the same driver, and walked into the same office building. But now, when people saw him, there was respect in their eyes, not just for his music, but for the man he had become. Edward, on the other hand, had also changed. His employees noticed that he smiled more often. He no longer walked through the halls with that constant, distant look of a man thinking only about profits and deadlines. He talked to people more, listened more, even joined them in the cafeteria sometimes. It was small things like that which made everyone realize that something inside him had softened. One morning, Daniel arrived at work to find Edward sitting quietly in the lounge area near the window. The sky outside was gray with the soft promise of rain. Edward waved him over. "Good morning," Daniel said. "Good morning," Edward replied. "Sit for a minute." Daniel sat down. "Everything all right?" Edward smiled faintly. "Yes, just thinking." "About what?" Edward looked out the window for a while before answering. "About how strange life is. You spend years chasing one thing, thinking it's the most important goal in the world. Then one small moment changes everything." Daniel nodded. "I know what you mean." Edward turned to him. "You know, that day when I asked you to play the piano, I thought it was just a harmless little challenge. I never imagined it would change both our lives." Daniel chuckled softly. "Neither did I." Edward leaned back. "It made me realize something important. I had everything, money, success, power, but I'd forgotten how to feel. You reminded me that people aren't meant to live only for achievements. We're meant to connect, to inspire, to create." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Music does that to people. It brings them back to themselves." Edward smiled. "It does, and you did that for me." There was a comfortable silence between them. The rain started tapping gently on the glass, soft and rhythmic, almost like a quiet melody of its own. Edward looked thoughtful again. "I've been meaning to tell you something. I'm planning to take a step back from the company." Daniel looked surprised. "Step back? You mean retire?" "Not exactly retire," Edward said. "Just slow down. I've spent most of my life building this business, but now I want to build something different, something meaningful." Daniel tilted his head. "What do you have in mind?" Edward smiled softly. "A foundation. For young musicians who can't afford instruments or lessons, I want to give them a chance just like I gave you." Daniel's eyes widened. "That's incredible, sir." Edward shook his head. "It's not just mine. It's ours. I want you to be part of it." "Me?" Daniel said, surprised. "But I don't know anything about running a foundation." "You don't have to," Edward said. "You know music. You know what it feels like to struggle and to dream. That's what matters. I want you to guide them, to show them that talent doesn't depend on where you come from, but on how much heart you put into it." Daniel sat quietly for a long moment. The weight of Edward's words settled over him. He looked at the older man and saw not just a boss, but a mentor, a friend. "I'd be honored," he said finally. Edward smiled. "Good. Then it settled." Weeks later, the Langford Music Foundation was officially announced. The launch event wasn't flashy, just a gathering of local teachers, young students, and a few journalists. The goal was simple: provide instruments, lessons, and guidance to anyone with a passion for music, no matter their background. Edward gave a short speech that day. He said, "Music has the power to reach where words cannot. This foundation isn't just about talent. It's about giving voices to those who have something to say but no instrument to say it with." When Daniel's turn came to speak, he didn't have any fancy notes or rehearsed lines. He simply said, "I was once a man who stopped dreaming. But one day, someone reminded me that it's never too late to start again. I hope this place does the same for others." The crowd applauded, not because his speech was perfect, but because it was real. That same day, they opened the doors of a small community music center, the first project funded by the foundation. Inside were a few donated instruments, a couple of pianos, some guitars, and shelves lined with sheet music. It wasn't grand, but it was filled with hope. When the first group of children arrived, Daniel guided them toward the instruments. Some were shy, others curious, all a little nervous. He sat at the piano and played a few gentle notes. Slowly, the tension melted away, and one by one, the kids began to explore. The room filled with the sound of clumsy but joyful music. Edward stood near the door, watching. He felt a lump in his throat. For years, he had invested in things that made him richer, but this was the first time he felt truly fulfilled. Later that evening, after everyone left, he stayed behind with Daniel. The center was quiet except for the faint hum of the city outside. "You did well today," Edward said softly. Daniel smiled. "You always say that," Edward chuckled. "Because it's always true." They both laughed quietly. Then Edward walked over to the piano and touched its smooth surface. "You know," he said, "I haven't played in years." Daniel looked surprised. "You can play?" "Barely," Edward admitted. "My mother taught me when I was young. I gave it up when I started working." Daniel smiled. "Then maybe it's time to start again." Edward hesitated for a moment, then sat down at the piano. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the keys. He pressed one note. It sounded soft and hesitant, like the voice of someone learning to speak again. Then another. Slowly, a simple melody began to take shape. Daniel stood beside him, smiling. "You remember more than you think." Edward kept playing, his touch growing steadier. The melody wasn't perfect, but it was heartfelt. After a few minutes, he stopped and looked up at Daniel. "Not bad for an old man, huh?" Daniel laughed. "Not bad at all." Edward smiled, a look of quiet contentment on his face. "Feels good," he said. "Like coming home." As the months went on, the foundation flourished. More centers opened across the city and hundreds of children began learning music for the first time. Many of them came from families who could never have afforded it otherwise. The sound of laughter and piano notes became part of Edward's everyday world. One afternoon, Daniel walked into Edward's office with a small package. "This came for you," he said. Edward opened it carefully. Inside was a framed letter written in neat handwriting. It was from one of the first students at the foundation, a girl who had received her first piano lessons there. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Langford, thank you for giving me the chance to learn music. When I play, I feel like I can breathe again. I want to be a music teacher one day and help others the way you helped me. You changed my life. With love, Lila." Edward read it twice before setting it down. His eyes glistened. "She's the same girl who talked to you after your concert, isn't she?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, the one who said she wanted to learn piano." Edward leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "Then it's all come full circle." Daniel smiled. "It really has." They sat there for a moment, the weight of everything they had built together sinking in. Not the money or the recognition, but the lives touched, the hearts opened. Edward looked out the window, where the sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the city. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think legacy meant leaving behind something people could see. A building, a company, a fortune. But now I realize the best legacy is the kind that people feel." Daniel nodded. "Like music," Edward smiled. "Exactly." That evening, after everyone left, Edward stayed behind one last time. He sat at the piano in the quiet room and began to play the melody Daniel had once played. For her. The sound filled the empty space, soft and pure. Each note carried a memory: his mother's smile, Daniel's first hesitant performance, the laughter of children learning to play. When he finished, he sat in silence for a while, feeling the peace that had long eluded him. Then he whispered softly, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, but to life itself, for bringing everything full circle. As he turned off the lights and stepped outside, Daniel was waiting by the door. "Ready to go?" he asked. Edward smiled. "Yes, let's go home." They walked side by side into the quiet evening, the sound of distant music drifting from a nearby window, a melody that belonged to no one and everyone at once. And in that moment, the millionaire and his once quiet employee knew, sometimes, the smallest challenge can awaken the deepest part of the soul and change two lives forever. After the album launch night, everything began to change. The video from the small studio event, recorded by one of the employees on her phone, started spreading online. She had uploaded a short clip of Daniel's final performance captioned, "When your boss discovers his employee is a hidden genius." She didn't expect much, maybe a few likes and comments from friends, but within days, the clip went viral. People from all over the world shared it. The emotion in Daniel's playing, the quiet tears in Edward's eyes at the end. Everything about it felt real and pure. It wasn't staged, it wasn't commercial. It was human, something people could feel deep inside even if they didn't know the whole story. Soon, journalists began reaching out. Music blogs wrote headlines like, "The Office pianist who moved a millionaire to tears." Some news outlets even called the company to confirm if the story was true. When Edward's assistant told him about it, he just smiled faintly and said, "Let them write. The story belongs to everyone now." Daniel, however, was overwhelmed. He wasn't used to attention. He had always been quiet, the kind of man who preferred being behind the scenes. Suddenly, strangers were messaging him, fans were asking for interviews, and even local radio stations wanted him to perform live. He still came to work every morning. He didn't quit or act differently. He still made his coffee, sat at his desk, and helped his coworkers. But something about him had changed. There was confidence in the way he moved, calmness in his smile. He no longer looked like someone just surviving each day. He looked like someone living it. One afternoon, Edward called him into the office again. When Daniel entered, he noticed two people sitting there, a man and a woman. Both looked like professionals, dressed neatly with friendly faces. Edward gestured for Daniel to sit. "These are my friends," Edward said. "They work with a small music label. They've heard your album and are very interested." Daniel's heart began to race. "Interested? In what way?" The woman smiled. "We think your music deserves a wider audience. We'd like to release it officially. Digital platforms, streaming, maybe even vinyl. We believe it has something rare, soul." Daniel blinked, still trying to process. "Are you serious?" Edward nodded. "They're very serious. But sir, I don't know anything about the music business," Daniel stammered. "I'm just..." The man leaned forward. "That's exactly why it works. You're not trying to be famous. You're just being honest. People can feel that." Daniel looked at Edward, uncertain. "What do you think I should do?" Edward smiled. "Follow your heart. That's what music is for, isn't it?" After a long pause, Daniel nodded. "All right, let's do it." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Contracts were signed, photos were taken, and the album was released online under the simple title, "For Her." The cover was minimal, just a black and white picture of a piano under soft light. Within days, it began gaining attention. Listeners described it as hauntingly beautiful, and music that feels like remembering someone you loved. Edward watched all this quietly from the background. He didn't take credit, didn't appear in interviews. When asked by a reporter about his role, he simply said, "I didn't create the music. I just gave it a place to be heard." But what truly surprised him wasn't the public's reaction. It was how much he had changed inside. The more time he spent around Daniel's music, the more he began to notice small things he used to ignore. The sound of birds in the morning, the way sunlight hit the office windows, the laughter of his employees during lunch breaks. He realized how many years he had spent chasing success while forgetting the beauty in simple things. One evening, he stayed late at the office. Everyone had gone home except Daniel, who was still finishing some work. The faint sound of typing echoed across the quiet floor. Edward looked up and said, "You don't have to stay so late anymore, you know. You're a recording artist now." Daniel smiled softly. "I still like working here. This place gave me a second chance." Edward leaned back. "You know, I envy you sometimes." "Me?" Daniel laughed lightly. "Why would you envy me?" "Because you do something I can't," Edward said. "You make people feel something with nothing but a few notes." Daniel thought for a moment. "Maybe you do it too, just in a different way." Edward looked at him curiously. "How so?" "Well," Daniel said, "you gave a man who'd stopped believing in himself a chance to dream again. That's more powerful than any song." Edward didn't reply immediately. He just smiled. A quiet, honest smile that said more than words could. Months passed. The album did better than anyone expected. It wasn't a massive commercial hit, but it found a devoted audience. Letters started arriving from people all over. Some saying the music helped them through grief, others saying it reminded them of love they'd lost. Every message touched Daniel deeply. Then one day, an invitation arrived from a cultural foundation. They were hosting a charity concert to raise funds for music education in underprivileged communities, and they wanted Daniel to perform. He hesitated at first, playing for a crowd that size felt intimidating, but Edward encouraged him. "Do it," he said. "Not for fame, For the kids who might find their voice the way you found yours. Daniel nodded. All right, but only if you come. Edward chuckled. Wouldn't miss it. The night of the concert was something Daniel would never forget. The venue was beautiful, an old theater with velvet curtains and warm lights. The audience was filled with people from every walk of life. Some had heard of him, some hadn't, but all were there for the music. Backstage, Daniel's hands trembled slightly. He looked at the piano waiting under the spotlight and felt that old nervousness creeping in. Edward noticed and walked over. You're ready, he said quietly. I don't know, Daniel admitted. Every time I think I'm ready, I start doubting. Edward put a hand on his shoulder. You don't need to prove anything. Just tell your story. Daniel nodded slowly. All right. When he stepped onto the stage, the applause was soft but warm. He sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes were gentle, like the sound of morning light touching a window. Then came the emotion, steady, deep, and honest. The melody filled the theater, wrapping around everyone like a soft memory. Some closed their eyes. Some leaned forward. It wasn't just a performance. It was a conversation between hearts. Halfway through, Daniel glanced toward the audience and saw Edward watching with quiet pride. Their eyes met for a brief second, and that was all the reassurance he needed. When he finished, the room was silent for a heartbeat, then filled with applause, long, sincere, and emotional. Daniel stood, bowed slightly, and smiled through tears. After the show, people came to congratulate him. Some thanked him for his music. Others asked for autographs. But the moment that stayed with him most was when a little girl walked up, holding her mother's hand. She said shyly, "Your song made me want to learn piano." Daniel knelt to her level and smiled. "Then you should. Music has a way of finding people who need it." The girl nodded and ran back to her mother. Daniel stood, heart full. Edward came up beside him. "You did well," he said softly. Daniel laughed. "You always say that, because it's always true." They walked outside together. The night air was cool and clear. The streetlights shimmered off the pavement. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Daniel said, "You know, it's strange." "What is?" Edward asked. "How everything started with a simple challenge," Daniel said. "Just you asking me to play one song." Edward smiled faintly. "And it turned into something I never expected." "Me neither," Daniel said. "But I'm grateful." "So am I," Edward replied quietly. They stood there in silence for a moment, two very different men whose lives had crossed in the most unexpected way. The millionaire and his employee, teacher and student in a sense, both changed by something simple and true. As they said goodnight and went their separate ways, Edward looked back once more. Daniel was walking away, hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed, humming softly to himself. It reminded Edward of the first night he had heard him play, only now the sound carried peace instead of pain. Edward whispered to himself, "You've done it, my friend. You found your song." And with that he smiled, not as a businessman but as a man who had finally remembered what it meant to feel alive. The night of the company event stayed in everyone's mind long after it ended. People talked about it for weeks, not just because the usually serious Edward Langford had looked proud, but because Daniel's performance had touched something in everyone there. Some said it was the best moment the company ever had. It wasn't just music. It was emotion, honesty, and life poured into sound. But for Daniel, that night was more than a performance. It was the first time in years he had felt whole again. As he walked home afterward, he couldn't stop smiling. The city lights shimmered on the wet streets, and he caught himself humming softly. For once, he didn't feel like just another employee lost in a crowd of faces. He felt seen. He felt alive. The next morning, Daniel came into work expecting things to go back to normal. Quiet days, spreadsheets, and coffee breaks. But the office was different. People greeted him with genuine warmth. They weren't teasing this time. They congratulated him, shook his hand, told him how his music made them feel. Some even said it reminded them of their families or their childhood. He was surprised by how deeply it had reached them. Later that afternoon, Edward called him into his office. Daniel knocked softly and stepped inside. Edward was sitting near the window again, staring out at the city below. "Good morning, sir," Daniel said. Edward turned slightly and smiled. "Good morning. Or should I say, maestro?" Daniel laughed nervously. "Please don't start that again." Edward chuckled quietly. Sit down. Daniel sat, his hands resting on his knees. He noticed a photo frame on Edward's desk, a black and white picture of a woman sitting at a piano, smiling. He had never seen it there before. Edward followed his gaze. "That's my mother," he said. "She taught me everything I know about discipline and music." Daniel nodded, unsure if he should say anything. "She looks kind," he finally said. "She was," Edward replied softly. "She used to play every night. I would sit by the door and listen. I never told her, but I learned to love music because of her." There was a pause. Edward's voice grew quieter. "When she passed away, I stopped listening. I thought keeping myself busy would help me forget. It didn't for a while, but hearing you play brought it all back." He smiled faintly. "You reminded me of her." Daniel felt his throat tighten. "I'm honored, sir," he said. "She must have been a special person." "She was," Edward said again. Then he looked directly at Daniel. "And I think she would have liked your music." Daniel's eyes dropped to the floor. He didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken to him like that, especially not his boss. Edward leaned back. "I've been thinking," he said. "You've got a gift, Daniel. It would be a shame to let it stay hidden behind a desk." Daniel frowned slightly. "I don't understand." Edward stood and walked toward the piano in the corner of the room. "I want to help you record your music professionally." Daniel blinked, stunned. "Record like an album?" Edward nodded. "Yes, I have the connections. The resources. You have the talent. I'll handle everything, the studio, the team, the marketing, all of it." Daniel sat in silence, his mind spinning. "Sir, that's too much. I can't let you do that," Edward smiled. "You're not letting me. I'm choosing to think of it as an investment, not in numbers, but in something that actually matters." Daniel hesitated. "Why me?" "Because I see myself in you," Edward said simply. "I see what happens when people bury their dreams under responsibility. You remind me what it means to feel again." Daniel swallowed hard. He could see in Edward's eyes that he meant every word. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "Say yes," Edward replied with a quiet smile. After a long pause, Daniel nodded. "All right, yes." Edward reached out and shook his hand. "Good. Then let's make something beautiful." The following weeks were unlike anything Daniel had ever experienced. Edward introduced him to a small recording studio owned by a friend. It wasn't flashy, a simple room with soft lighting and a beautiful grand piano in the center. But the first time Daniel sat there, headphones over his ears, the world outside disappeared. At first he was nervous. The red recording light made him freeze and his fingers stumbled over the keys. But soon the music took over. He played pieces he had written late at night. Quiet, emotional melodies that told stories of loss, hope, and rediscovery. Edward attended almost every session, sitting quietly in the corner listening. Sometimes when Daniel struggled with a part, Edward would say, "Stop thinking about perfection. Just play what you feel." And every time he did, the result was magical. The sound engineer, an older man with silver hair, turned to Edward one evening and said, "You've got something special here. His music isn't loud, but it speaks." Edward just nodded. "Yes, it does." As the days turned into weeks, Daniel grew more confident. The songs came together one by one, 10 tracks filled with emotion and honesty. He decided to dedicate the album to his mother, just as Edward had once remembered his own. When he told Edward that, the older man smiled and said, "Then it's not just music, it's legacy." One afternoon, after finishing the final recording, Daniel played one last piece. It wasn't planned. He just started playing from the heart, letting his fingers move freely. The melody was gentle at first, then powerful, almost like a conversation between past and present. By the time he finished, there were tears in Edward's eyes. "What's that piece called?" Edward asked quietly. Daniel looked down, thinking, "I don't know, maybe." "For her." Edward nodded slowly. "That's perfect." A few weeks later, the album was ready. Edward arranged for a small private event to celebrate. Nothing extravagant, just a gathering of friends, employees, and a few local music lovers. The studio was dimly lit, the atmosphere warm and intimate. When Daniel walked in, he was surprised to see how many people had come. His colleagues were there, smiling proudly. Even some of Edward's business partners had shown up, curious to see what had moved the famously serious man to sponsor a music project. Edward stood at the front and said a few words. Most of you know me as a businessman, he began. Someone who deals with numbers and results. But life isn't just about success, it's about the things that make us feel alive. A few months ago, I challenged one of my employees to play the piano. I didn't expect much, but what happened that day changed me. He looked at Daniel. Tonight, I want you to hear what honesty sounds like. Daniel took his place at the piano. The room fell silent. He began to play. This time there was no fear, no hesitation. His music flowed naturally, each note filled with warmth and memory. Some people closed their eyes. Others wiped their tears quietly. Edward stood at the back, hands clasped, watching with quiet pride. When the final note faded, there was silence again. The kind of silence that means everyone has felt something deep. Then came the applause. Loud, long, genuine. Edward stepped forward and shook Daniel's hand. You did it, he said softly. Daniel smiled through tears. No, we did. Edward looked around the room and at the people smiling, the warmth in the air, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. That night, after everyone had left, Daniel and Edward stayed behind. The studio was quiet except for the faint hum of the city outside. Edward sat down beside the piano and said, You know, my mother once told me something. She said, Music is the only language that never lies. Daniel nodded. She was right. Edward smiled. So was yours, I think. For a long moment, they just sat there, two men from different worlds connected not by money or power, but by something far more human. As they turned off the lights and walked out, Edward looked back at the piano and said softly, I think she would have been proud. Daniel smiled. Both of them would. And for the first time in a very long time, Edward felt like something inside him had healed. The following week moved quietly at Langford Technologies. Work went on as usual, meetings, deadlines, reports. But something had shifted in the air. People noticed that their boss, Edward Langford, seemed a little different. He wasn't smiling exactly, but the hard edge in his voice had softened. He still demanded excellence, but there was a new kind of calm around him. Daniel kept to himself as always, though now, every time he passed the grand piano in the lounge, he couldn't help but look at it. Sometimes he caught Edward doing the same. It felt like there was an unspoken understanding between them. Something neither of them needed to talk about, but both could feel. At home, Daniel's tiny keyboard had become his favorite thing. Each night after finishing dinner and answering a few work emails, he would sit down and play. At first it was just old tunes he remembered from childhood. Then slowly he started creating new melodies, little fragments of music that came from his heart shaped by the years of silence and struggle. He didn't tell anyone. It wasn't for attention or praise. It was just for him. One evening, as he was practicing, he got an unexpected message on his phone. It was from Edward. Be in the lounge at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Bring your music. Daniel stared at the message for a long time. Bring your music? He thought. What did that even mean? He didn't have sheet music. Everything he played was from memory or improvised. He almost replied to say so, but stopped himself. It was better to just show up and find out. The next morning, the office was still quiet when Daniel walked into the lounge. Sunlight was spilling across the floor. Edward was already there, standing near the piano with a cup of coffee in his hand. Good morning, Edward said. Good morning, sir, Daniel replied, his voice cautious. Edward gestured toward the piano. Play something. The same one from the other day. Daniel hesitated. Here, now? Edward nodded. Yes, the acoustics are better in the morning. Fewer distractions. Daniel sat down, took a deep breath, and began to play. His fingers moved more confidently this time, the notes flowing with emotion instead of fear. The sound filled the room, soft and warm, reaching every corner. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, listening. When the song ended, he set down his cup and said, Do you know what I realized when you played that last time? Daniel looked up. What's that, sir? Edward's voice was low, almost thoughtful. I realized how long it's been since I felt something real. Daniel wasn't sure how to respond. He stayed quiet, waiting. Edward continued. I built everything I have by staying focused, by shutting out anything that distracted me. Feelings, emotions, relationships, all of it, it worked. I became successful. But somewhere along the way, I lost something. He paused. And for some reason, when you play, I remember what that was. Daniel looked down at the piano keys. Music can do that, he said quietly. It reminds us who we are. Edward gave a faint smile. You're right. He walked over to the piano and stood beside Daniel. Tell me, if you could play again, really play, what would you do with it? Daniel blinked, unsure if it was a serious question. I don't know, he said honestly. When I was younger, I wanted to compose. Maybe teach, but that was before life got complicated. Edward nodded slowly, as if weighing something in his mind. Then he said, Would you be willing to play at our next company event? Daniel's eyes widened. What? No, I can't do that. Why not? Edward asked, tilting his head. I'm not a professional. I haven't performed in years. Besides, it's a corporate event, not a concert. Edward gave a small shrug. Exactly. No one will expect perfection. But I think it would be good for you and for everyone else. You reminded this place that people are more than their job titles. I want that spirit to stay. Daniel hesitated, his pulse quickening. The thought of playing in front of hundreds of people made his stomach twist. But the way Edward said it, calm, encouraging, made it hard to say no. I'll think about it, Daniel said finally. Good, Edward replied, smiling slightly, because I've already added your name to the schedule. Daniel laughed softly. You really don't take no for an answer, do you? Not when I believe in something, Edward said, and for the first time Daniel saw not the billionaire but a man who meant every word. Over the next few weeks, Daniel practiced every evening. The keyboard wasn't enough anymore, so Edward arranged for a piano to be delivered to Daniel's apartment, quietly, without asking. When Daniel saw it, he was speechless. There was a note taped to the lid that simply said, Consider it an investment in something that matters. Every night, the small apartment filled with music. At first, the neighbors were surprised. Then, one by one, they began to leave notes on his door, kind ones, saying how the music made their evenings brighter. It encouraged him to keep going. Meanwhile, Edward started spending more time in the lounge after hours. Sometimes he'd play a few simple chords himself, awkwardly pressing the keys like someone rediscovering an old friend. He wasn't good, but it didn't matter. It felt peaceful. One evening, Daniel walked in after finishing a meeting and saw Edward sitting at the piano. The sight was so unusual he almost turned around. Edward noticed him and smiled faintly. Don't just stand there, he said. Come teach me how to play something. Daniel hesitated, then laughed. You're serious? Completely. So Daniel walked over and sat beside him. For the next hour, they went over simple melodies. Edward struggled at first, missing notes, laughing at his own mistakes. It was the first time Daniel had seen him laugh, really laugh, not the polite kind used in meetings, but a genuine human laugh. When they finished, Edward leaned back and said, You know, I can handle billion-dollar deals, but 3 notes on this thing and I'm lost. Daniel grinned. That's because music doesn't follow business rules. Edward looked thoughtful. Maybe that's why I like it. After that night, the two men began to share quiet moments like that, sometimes talking about music, sometimes about life. Daniel learned that Edward had once loved music as a boy, but his father had pushed him toward business instead. He said music was for dreamers, Edward admitted once. So I stopped dreaming. Daniel understood that feeling all too well. As the company event drew closer, Daniel grew more nervous. He practiced until his fingers ached, wanting every note to be perfect. But Edward reminded him, don't play to impress. Play to feel. That's what moved people last time. The night of the event finally came. The venue was decorated beautifully, filled with lights, tables, and people dressed in suits and evening gowns. Daniel stood backstage, his heart pounding. He could hear the crowd's chatter, the laughter, the clinking of glasses. Edward came over, adjusting his cufflinks. You ready? He asked. I think so, Daniel said, though his voice trembled. Edward put a hand on his shoulder. Don't think of them. Think of your music. Daniel nodded. When his name was announced, he walked out onto the stage. The grand piano sat under a soft spotlight waiting for him. As he sat down, everything went quiet. He looked out at the crowd, hundreds of faces, and then spotted Edward sitting near the front, giving him a small nod. Daniel closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first few notes were gentle, uncertain, but soon the melody unfolded, full of emotion, warmth, and life. It wasn't a flashy performance. It was honest. Every note told a story of struggle, loss, hope, and rediscovery. People in the audience grew still. Conversations stopped. Phones were lowered. For a few minutes, the entire room was carried somewhere else, into the world Daniel had created through his music. When he finished, the silence that followed was deep. Then slowly applause began. It grew louder and louder until the whole room was on its feet. Daniel stood, stunned. He had never felt anything like it. He looked toward Edward, who was clapping with a quiet smile, a rare expression of pride and something more. Understanding. That night, as Daniel walked home, he felt lighter than he had in years. The sound of the applause still echoed in his ears. But what mattered most wasn't the crowd. It was the feeling that he had finally brought a part of himself back to life. Edward, too, left the event with something stirring inside him, something he hadn't felt since he was a young man. As he sat in his car, he thought to himself, maybe success isn't about how much you earn, but about what you bring back to life, in others and in yourself. Neither of them knew it yet. But what happened that night would set in motion a chain of events that neither money nor power could control. The office felt quieter after that day. People still talked about what had happened, though always in hushed voices. They said they'd never seen anything like it before. Not in that place. It wasn't about the piano anymore. It was about how something so simple had changed the mood of the whole company. Daniel, however, tried to forget it. He told himself it didn't mean anything. It was just a moment, a few notes played to please his boss. But deep down, he knew it had stirred something inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. That night, he went home and sat at his kitchen table, staring at his hands. They still remembered the feeling of the keys, the weight, the rhythm, the warmth of the sound. It was strange. For so long, his hands had only touched keyboards and spreadsheets, not music. Now they itched to play again. His apartment was small but neat. The walls were bare except for a few old photos. One of them showed him as a boy sitting beside his mother, both smiling next to a piano that no longer existed. He touched the photo gently and whispered, "You'd laugh if you saw what happened today." He didn't have a piano anymore. Not even a small one. But that night he opened his laptop and searched for videos of people playing the songs he used to love. As he listened, something in his chest tightened. A mixture of joy and sadness he couldn't explain. Meanwhile, across town, Edward Langford sat alone in his large office, long after everyone else had gone home. The city lights shimmered outside his window. His desk was covered in papers, but he wasn't looking at them. He was staring at the grand piano in the corner. He had bought it years ago, thinking it made the space look sophisticated. It had never been played until that day. Now, every time he looked at it, he could still hear Daniel's hesitant melody echoing faintly in his mind. It wasn't that the performance had been perfect, far from it. But something about it had reached him in a way he didn't understand. Maybe it was the honesty in it. Or maybe it was because the tune reminded him of something buried deep in his own past. He walked over to the piano and brushed his fingers across the lid. The cool surface reflected his tired face. For a brief moment, he wondered if he could still play a few notes himself. But that thought faded as quickly as it came. He hadn't touched a piano since he was a boy, since long before life had turned into boardrooms, deals, and deadlines. The next morning, Daniel came into work early as usual. He hoped to slip into his desk unnoticed, but that plan didn't last long. His colleagues greeted him with smiles and teasing comments. "So, Maestro," one of them said, "planning your concert tour yet?" Daniel laughed awkwardly. "Very funny," he said. "It was just a few notes." "Yeah, but you made the boss actually smile," another said. "That's worth a medal." Daniel smiled politely, but he felt uncomfortable being the center of attention. He preferred quiet corners and unnoticed work. He sat down at his desk and tried to focus, but his mind kept drifting back to the piano and to the strange look on Edward's face afterward. Late that afternoon, as Daniel was finishing up his reports, his phone buzzed. A message appeared. "Come to my office." His heart skipped. Edward didn't usually summon people unless it was serious. Daniel took a deep breath and made his way upstairs. The large glass door was open. Edward stood near the window, his back to him, watching the city below. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Daniel asked carefully. Edward turned around, his expression unreadable. Yes, sit down. Daniel sat across from him, trying to keep his nerves steady. Edward leaned back slightly. You surprised me the other day, he said. I didn't expect you to actually play. I didn't expect to either, Daniel admitted. It's been a long time, Edward nodded. You were good. Not polished, but good. There was something in the way you played. Daniel didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded. After a pause, Edward asked, Why did you stop? Daniel blinked. Stop playing? Yes, he hesitated. Life got in the way, I guess. My father got sick when I was a teenager. We needed money, so I started working part-time. Later, after he passed, I couldn't afford lessons anymore. I just stopped. Edward studied him quietly. And you never played again? Not really. Maybe once or twice, but it hurt too much. My mother always said I had something special, but I couldn't see it back then. Edward's voice softened slightly. She was right. Daniel looked up, surprised. Sir? Talent like that doesn't fade, Edward said. It just waits. There was a silence between them. Outside, the sky had turned orange with the setting sun. Do you miss it? Edward asked. Daniel thought for a long moment. Every day, he said quietly. But life doesn't stop just because you miss something. Edward leaned forward. Maybe it should sometimes. Daniel frowned slightly. He didn't understand what Edward meant, but there was something heavy in his tone, like he was speaking from experience. Edward stood up and walked toward the piano. Play something, he said. Daniel froze. Right now? Yes, something real this time. Not for the office, not for me, just play. Daniel hesitated, but eventually stood and moved toward the piano again. His hands felt the same nervous tremble as before. He sat down and took a breath. He didn't play the same tune this time. Instead, he began with a slower, deeper melody, one that came to him in the moment. It was soft and uncertain at first, but then it grew into something full of emotion, a story told through sound instead of words. Edward stood behind him, listening silently. Each note seemed to peel away a layer of the cold businessman image he wore every day. The sound filled the room, echoing off the glass and wood, filling every corner with warmth. When Daniel stopped, the silence that followed was almost painful. Edward finally spoke. Do you know what that song reminded me of? He said quietly. Daniel shook his head. My mother, Edward said. She used to play something like that. I haven't thought about it in years. Daniel turned to look at him. There was a softness in Edward's face he hadn't seen before. The man who was usually so controlled suddenly looked almost human, fragile even. I'm sorry, Daniel said. Edward shook his head. Don't be. It's strange, isn't it? How a few notes can bring back an entire lifetime. Daniel nodded slowly. Music does that. It remembers for us when we forget. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The room felt different now, less like a boss's office and more like a quiet place where two lives had briefly crossed paths through something beyond business. Finally, Edward turned back toward his desk. You can go, he said softly. And Daniel, yes, sir? Edward gave a faint smile. Don't stop again. Daniel nodded and left the room. As he walked down the hallway, he couldn't help but feel that something had shifted, not just in Edward, but in himself too. That night, when he got home, he did something he hadn't done in years. He went online and searched for a second-hand keyboard. He found one that was old but still working. It wasn't much, but it was enough. When it arrived 2 days later, he placed it on the small table in his living room. The first time he pressed the keys, the sound was tinny and imperfect, but he didn't care. He played until late into the night, rediscovering pieces of himself with every note. Across the city, Edward found himself unable to sleep. He sat by his window again, thinking about his mother, about the life he'd built, and about the strange feeling that had been haunting him since Daniel played that day. He realized something he hadn't admitted to himself before. For all his wealth, for all his success, he had lost touch with the things that once made him feel alive. He had traded meaning for power, and the silence of his empty penthouse reminded him of it every night. But now, for the first time in years, he felt something stir, the faint sound of music, echoing in his memory. Neither of them knew it yet, but that quiet connection, the boss and the employee, the businessman and the pianist, was only the beginning of something that would change them both forever. The sun spilled through the tall windows of Langford Technologies, painting golden stripes across the polished marble floor. The office was a world of glass, metal, and quiet footsteps. The kind of place where everyone moved with purpose, careful not to make mistakes under the watchful eyes of their boss. Edward Langford, the man who built the company from nothing, stood at the center of it all. He was known across the industry as a genius businessman, sharp, confident, and intimidating. People respected him, but they also feared him. He wasn't cruel, but he had little patience for excuses or weakness. When he spoke, everyone listened. Edward wasn't the kind of man who liked surprises. He liked order. He liked control. Every part of his business, from the lighting in the hallways to the tone of the emails, had to reflect perfection. He often said, "If you're going to do something, do it better than anyone else." It was a rule everyone lived by inside those glass walls. That Friday afternoon, Edward had called for a small team gathering. It wasn't something he did often. In fact, many couldn't remember the last time he'd smiled in a meeting. But the company had just closed a huge deal, and even Edward believed it was worth celebrating. The employees gathered in the open lounge area near the large windows. A few laughed quietly, holding paper cups of sparkling water. Music played softly in the background. The mood was light, though everyone still kept one eye on Edward, unsure if they were really allowed to relax. At one corner of the lounge stood a grand piano. It was an old Steinway, black and glossy, placed there mostly for decoration. No one had ever dared to play it. It was one of those things that just looked nice in a billionaire's office, a symbol of taste, not use. Edward leaned against the table, looking over his team with a faint smile. "You've all done well," he said. "Better than I expected, honestly. So today let's pretend to be human for once." The group laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. Edward wasn't joking, and somehow everyone knew it. Someone mentioned music. Someone else joked about playing the piano. That's when Edward's sharp eyes caught sight of Daniel Carter, a quiet man in his early 30s who worked in data analysis. Daniel wasn't the type to speak much. He came to work early, left late, and rarely joined in small talk. But he was known for being calm, focused, and incredibly good at his job. "You," Edward said suddenly, pointing at him. "Daniel, isn't it? You used to play the piano, didn't you?" All eyes turned toward Daniel. He froze, caught off guard. Yes, sir." "A little," he said softly. Edward raised an eyebrow.
"A little?"
"I heard you played for years." Daniel gave a small, nervous laugh. "That was a long time ago." The room grew still. Edward took a step closer to the piano and tapped a finger against it. "Well then," he said, "why don't you show us?" A few people chuckled uncertainly. Surely he was joking, but Edward's face stayed serious. He wasn't joking. Daniel looked around. Everyone was staring at him now. Curious, some even whispering. He felt his stomach twist. It had been more than a decade since he last played. The thought of touching the keys again in front of his boss and the entire team made his heart race. "Sir, I don't think," Daniel began, but Edward interrupted him. "Come on," he said, his tone light but his eyes challenging. "It's just a few notes. Let's see if that talent is still somewhere in there." The silence in the room grew heavy. Daniel glanced at the piano. The black surface reflected his nervous face. His palms were already sweating. He didn't want to be the center of attention, not here, not like this. But he also knew saying no to Edward wasn't really an option. He forced a small smile. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll try." A soft murmur rippled through the group as he stepped forward. The sound of his shoes against the marble echoed louder than it should have. When he reached the piano, he paused for a moment, his hand hovering above the lid. He could feel everyone watching him, and somehow that made the room feel even smaller. Edward folded his arms and leaned against a chair, waiting. "No pressure," he said with a grin. "Just the whole company watching you." Daniel took a slow breath and sat down. His fingers brushed over the keys, smooth and cool under his skin. It was strange, the smell of the polished wood, the faint sound of the piano bench creaking. It all brought back memories he hadn't thought about in years. He remembered the small living room of his old house, the second-hand upright piano his mother had bought when he was 8. She used to sit beside him, smiling, even when his playing was terrible. "Music," she'd say, "is how the soul talks when words fail." He hadn't thought about that in a long time. Life had pushed him in a different direction. When his father got sick, the lessons stopped. The piano was sold to pay bills. Daniel went to work, studied finance, and did everything he could to build a stable life. Music became something that belonged to another version of him, a boy who had dreams, not responsibilities. He pressed a single key. The note rang out, soft and clear. A few people held their breath. "Go on," Edward said quietly. Daniel nodded slightly. His hands trembled as he tried to recall something simple. Maybe a tune he used to play as a child. But his mind was blank. For a long moment, he just sat there, frozen between past and present, between who he was and who he'd become. Someone coughed in the back. The tension grew. Then, almost without thinking, Daniel began to play. Just a few notes at first, awkward, uneven. But then, as his fingers started to move, something inside him loosened. The melody took shape, fragile but real. It was a soft tune, one he used to play for his mother when she was sick. He hadn't played it since she passed. It was simple, almost childish, but it carried a kind of honesty that couldn't be faked. The sound filled the room, warm and gentle. The office noise disappeared. No phones ringing, no whispers. Just the piano and Daniel, lost somewhere between memory and music. Edward watched silently. His expression softened slightly, though no one noticed. There was something about the way Daniel played. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Each note seemed to come from someplace deep. When Daniel stopped, the room stayed silent for a moment. Then a few people started to clap, slowly at first, then louder. Daniel gave a small, embarrassed smile and stood up. Edward didn't clap. He just looked at him for a long moment, studying him as if trying to understand something. "Not bad," Edward said finally. "You've still got it." Daniel nodded, unsure what to say. "Thank you, sir." Edward's voice turned thoughtful. "You know," he said, glancing at the piano, "most people forget the things that once made them feel alive. They trade them for comfort, for money, for what they think is security." He paused, meeting Daniel's eyes. "But sometimes that old fire is still there. You just need a reason to play again." Daniel wasn't sure what to make of that. It almost sounded like Edward was talking about himself. The rest of the team returned to their conversations, but something had shifted. The air in the room felt different, lighter somehow. Daniel quietly moved back to his corner, but his mind was somewhere else. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, a small spark he thought had long died. Edward, meanwhile, stood near the window, watching the city skyline. He didn't say anything more, but the look in his eyes wasn't his usual sharp, calculating one. There was something else there, something distant, almost nostalgic. As the employees began to leave, Edward turned once more to glance at the piano. The black surface reflected the fading sunlight. He stood there for a long moment, lost in thought. No one knew it yet, but that small challenge, a simple test, a passing moment, was about to change both their lives in ways neither could imagine.